Let's trace air in the respiratory system. To see the complete tracing, turn to the Q drive, open up the unit on the respiratory system, and look at the document there that has the complete tracing of the respiratory system. Notice at the top of that tracing there are 5 different tissues that line the respiratory tract along the way. You have to know each of these tissues. Stratified squamous epithelium, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, simple ciliated columnar epithelium, simple cuboidal epithelium, and simple squamous epithelium. Notice they are abbreviated, and the abbreviations occur within the tracing below. They are in bold print. Now, unless the tissue lining the respiratory tract changes in that tracing, it is the same tissue lining all the way. For example, in the vestibule, you have stratified squamous epithelium, and then in the nasal concha, you notice that you have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. That means the nasal septum also has stratified squamous epithelium, because the tissue doesn't change until you see a change in the tissue indicated along the tracing. So, let's get started. It all starts at the external nares, or the nostrils. What's the epithelial tissue there? And in the vestibule? Yeah, as we just said, it's stratified squamous epithelium. Now, does that make sense? Stratified squamous is in layers. Does it make sense to have layered tissue in the vestibule and in the external nares? Well, think about what can go into and out of that first part of the respiratory system, including your finger. No, get your finger out of your nose. Your finger could go in there, or other objects, and it could do damage to simple tissues. So you have to have that stratified squamous epithelium there. As we get deeper into the respiratory system, it makes sense to have pseudostratified, which is a single layer, and to have the cilia. The cilia are there to move the mucus around to trap particles of air pollutants that might go into your lungs. So the septum is the dividing plane between the left and the right nasal cavity. And then you come to the nasal concha. We learned about nasal concha earlier. There is a superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha. Those are the ridges. And then the valleys in between each of those are the meatuses. And they are the superior, middle, and inferior nasal meatus. So if you had to compare concha and meatuses to valleys and ridges, the concha would be the ridges and the meatuses would be the valley. Air flows through the valley. Air flows through the meatuses. And it's here where the air is moistened and warmed. Now these line the nasal cavity deeper behind the vestibule, and they are lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Air would go by the openings of the paranasal sinus, we call ducts of the paranasal sinuses, and then into the choanae. Choana is the internal nares. It's the dividing line between the nasal cavity and the pharynx. The pharynx is the throat area. The pharynx is divided into 3 sections, as we see here. The nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. In the first section, the nasopharynx, you go past the choana and you've now entered the throat, or the pharynx. Notice it's not pharynx, it is pharynx, like the larynx. The nasal pharynx is an area where you have the auditory tube opening coming in. You have the pharyngeal tonsils there. We sometimes call these just the tonsils, but there are 2 other kinds of tonsils you'll see in a second. So we have the pharyngeal tonsils, and then you have the uvula. The uvula is the little punching bag that hangs down in the back of the throat. The next region is the oropharynx. The oropharynx is lined with stratified squamous epithelium again. So notice that you jump from the vestibule with stratified squamous epithelium to the nasal concha with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and then you come back to stratified squamous epithelium. Does this make sense? What's going to happen at the oropharynx? Yeah, that's where the potato chip is going to slide by, and you don't want to damage a thin layer, so you have to have a layer that's thick, a stratified layer, so outside cells can be damaged and the inner cells can give rise to new outside cells. Stratified squamous epithelium then is found in the oropharynx. There is where you'll find the other two tonsils, the palatine and the lingual tonsils. The third region of the pharynx is the laryngopharynx. That's the laryngopharynx because it's next to the larynx. And then you come to the larynx, and the larynx has the epiglottis, and then the air is going to go through the glottis, and then by or over the superior vocal cords and the inferior vocal cords. Superior vocal cords are a shelf of tissue, sometimes called the false vocal cords, and then the true vocal cords are the inferior vocal cords. From the larynx, you go into the trachea. The trachea again is lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and the trachea is the windpipe, the tube that conducts air towards the lungs. At a structure called the carina, the air is divided, or the trachea is divided into the two primary bronchi. Bronchus is singular, bronchi is plural. Here we continue to have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium with their little cilia beating mucus about and trapping particles of dust and other garbage that's in the air. From the primary bronchus, we go to the secondary bronchus, branching into many secondary bronchi, and then many segmental bronchi will be next. Then you enter little tiny tubes, and little tiny tubes are called bronchioles. Bronchiole means small tube. And then you go to the terminal bronchioles, and the terminal bronchioles has simple ciliated columnar epithelium. Yep, that one's going to be difficult to figure out. It's only in one spot at the terminal bronchioles where you have this unusual tissue, the simple ciliated columnar epithelium. One layer of ciliated cells. It's a little different from the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Next we come into the respiratory bronchioles, which are lined with simple cuboidal epithelium, and then into the alveolar duct, which is the entranceway into a sac. The alveolar sacs are made up of a group of little tiny sacs called the alveoli. The alveolar sacs are lined with simple squamous epithelium. Does that make sense? The alveoli are lined with simple squamous epithelium. Yes, that makes sense. That's a simple thin layer which allows for the diffusion of gases across. And here is where the gases do diffuse across, from the alveoli through the basement membrane surrounding those alveoli into the plasma of the blood, which is the fluid part of the blood, and then eventually diffuses into a RBC, a red blood cell. Red blood cells contain hemoglobin, and it is here that the oxygen latches on to be carried throughout the body to the various tissues which have oxygen demand. There you have that giant tracing of the respiratory system. Now all you have to do is put it all together. Memorize this, know all the models, learn about the breathing mechanisms, and you got it made. See you on the oral.